Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marius Roodt, and I'm standing in for Nicholas Lorimer today, who's busy moving. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of the Daily Friend Show. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, the indefatigable Terence Corrigan. Hello, Terence.
It's been a long time since someone's called me indefatigable.
And the indomitable Sara gone. Hello, Sara.
I get called indomitable quite a lot. I'm not sure if that's a compliment.
I think it is, but yeah, we can take it under advisement. I think the first thing we're going to talk about today is a story that came out that a number of black farmers have been pushed off their land pushed off farms that they've been given by the government, and they've been pushed off apparently by ANC cronies. And so, this looks like this kind of could be, a dry run for expropriation of that compensation, because that's probably most likely what's going to be what would happen if we actually do pass it law. But Terence, do you want to tell us a bit about that? And if anybody doesn't know, Terence is probably the leading voice on the dangers of expropriation of that compensation in the country at once.
Which makes me both loved and hated. It's a business day led with an article, Eviction of Black Farmers Raises Questions About Readiness for Land Reform. This is actually not a new story. There have been bits and pieces of it coming up for years. And independent of the EWC agenda is the fact that for the last decade at least, the government has shown a dreadful unwillingness to extend property rights to black people who are the recipient of state assets. Now this actually has a precedent that goes back to the apartheid era, where black people were held not to hold their assets in the same way as white and later colored and Indian people. Whereas a white homeowner would own the home and have a title deed to prove it. Black people in townships would maybe have a 99-year lease, which for a long time was contingent on them having a job in the city and therefore leave to remain. I think it was only about 1984 that black people in South Africa's urban areas, outside very small specific places like the Edendale Valley and Pietermaritzburg, were able to hold anything freehold. Now, what's happened is that post 1994, a lot of this just remained in place. You have millions and millions of people living in the former homelands where they have some sort of permission to occupy or established right to a particular plot of land, which has never been converted into any kind of ownership. It's very, very precarious. And in the urban centres, this state provided RDP housing model was retained, even when people were actually given houses in many respects. They were not given ownership to them, or they were given a sort of conditional ownership, which restricted your ability to sell the property for a number of years. But the sort of idea of a firm state hand on the tiller was very much part of the official conception. What we've seen recently is that the government has made a big issue of its supposed commitment to land reform. And we saw last year, when it was allegedly releasing 700,000 hectares of state-owned land, that a lot of the stuff that was now being released was in fact occupied by land reform beneficiaries, and some of these guys had actually been able to do quite well in it. But they found these properties being advertised. More recently, we've seen issues. The Ivan Clutie case in the Western Cape, which turns out is now being reversed because there was an investigation and the minister admitted that he was treated very unfairly. There are a number of others.
It was moved to three different farms, I believe. Ivan Clutie.
It
around, and he was a successful farmer. It seems like he was doing quite a good job.
Yeah, well, there was the case of David Rogase, the guy who's been occupying this property since the days of the old Maputo Tswana. Has been trying to buy it for the last 20 years, and the government fought him every step of the way.
So, sorry, what do you? Sorry.
No. Look, basically, I think what you have here is a policy, and I would say also an ideological commitment that is very hostile to the notion of ownership. This firm, benevolent state hand on the tiller will make it possible for everyone to get their just allotment. Gugile and Quinty said this very, very clearly in the 2018 debate on the expropriation, the amendment to the Constitution. Very, very clear that yes, there's now going to be this radical restructuring of land ownership, and they will not be giving title. Now that was almost entirely missed, and it's been confused, I think, probably deliberately by some in government. Probably some in government don't fully understand it. And I think there's been a remarkable lack of curiosity by many in the media. So you hear, well, this is about returning land to their rightful owners, or well, most of those rightful owners are not going to own it. They might have some conditional access dependent on the goodwill of an official who may have no knowledge of farming. And I think what we're seeing here, cumulative in these cases, is a combination of venality and incompetence. I imagine that possibly what happened with the 700,000 hectares was that there was some sort of directive: find land we can redistribute, and someone just went to the filing cabinet and pulled out a whole bunch of papers and said, well, here's 100,000 hectares. I'm not going to bother to check whether anyone's actually on them.
But as you say, it's an ideological. That's ideology from the government. They say that I think amongst some in the government, there's a very serious hostility against the private ownership, and it's obviously going back to a lot of the ANC people kind of got their training in the old Soviet Union, and there's still, strong Soviet influence, I think, in lots of the thinking amongst the important ANC people. But Sara, what do you make of it? What do you think? Is this kind of a dry run for EWC? Is this what we're going to see? What's going to happen if expropriation without compensation does become law?
I think it is a dry run, but it's not even a dry run. It goes back so far. We've been alerted to numerous cases where people have worked for farms for a long time. Suddenly they get harassed and intimidated and threatened by a chief and his henchman, or a policeman and his henchman, or an ANC official and his henchman, and eventually they end up leaving the farm, and the person goes on. The aggressor goes on, takes the land, and nothing ever happens. I think there's this sort of grubby ideology of anyone who has in any way connected to the ruling party has felt free to take land away from other people, and I suspect the problem in this country is greater than we'd like to think. The other thing is that we know the ideology is fundamentally against private ownership. The problem is that we know that the private ownership of land and property is one of the absolutely sure ways of people lifting themselves out of poverty, having assets that they can bond and develop their lives. And if you don't have that ownership, that simply isn't there. Nothing changes. Absolutely nothing changes for people. I don't think this worries the ANC, because I think they're so ideologically hardbound. And it sounds funny to say ideologically hardbound, because I think the ideology is so much just about, as Terence said, venality, envy. I don't even know there are no positives in this. And then the other thing is, there seems to be, well, we'll give you whatever we give you will not be owned by you, so we're sort of not giving it to you, we're kind of renting it or loaning it to you. But in the cities, people will own suburban property. Obviously the government may very well try and take that under EWC as well. So you're going to end up with this dichotomy, which I think under the ANC is just going to get messy and nasty. And land reform is going to be, there's going to be no reform as such. It's just going to sort of fizzle into a war of attrition between the government and various people who have more or less rights, land rights,
but
to benefit from or not.
This isn't the first time we hearing the song. I mean, it happened in Zimbabwe and ZANU-PF, where it was also land reform was ostensibly to restore land to people who'd had it taken away from them, whatever the case is. But we saw ZANU-PF officials were given the prime farms, the very productive, profitable farms. There's stories people linked to the Mugabes and ZANU-PF, that you find out they had like 5 farms or whatever the case is. And I mean, it's quite likely this is going to happen here. And we've seen already how the ANC cronies are taking away productive from farms, not from land reform beneficiaries. So it's quite worrying. And like I said, it's grimly predictable, really.
Well, let's put it this way. The only thing that we're likely to see from land reform, given the socialist ideology, is a massively bloated, in every sense of the word, ruling elite, and pretty much more or less poor proletariat, whatever you want to call them, and the possibility, as we've seen in Zimbabwe and Ukraine and drought. Not drought, famines.
Yes, exactly. Do you have any final thoughts, Terence? I mean, you, as I say, you're one of the experts in this. What is the solution here?
Well, look, I think one should just add that there's another piece of legislation, the amendment to the so-called Ultra Act, which is about people residing in traditional communities, which seems to be aimed at making it more discretionary and therefore probably harder for people to convert sort of permissions to occupy into ownership. And I attended a hearing organized by one of the provincial legislatures on this, and there did seem to be some concern, which I found interesting and quite refreshing from some people in the ANC, that this was likely to be the case. So I wonder whether everybody within the ANC and the government fully understands that program. And I think all the evidence we have suggests that South Africans of all stripes have a strong commitment to the idea that you get to own your stuff. In fact, I remember when I started my career back in the 1990s, speaking to an African gentleman, generation of 1976, and he said that Africans are sit very uncomfortably in relation to communism, because African culture has traditionally been about owning things, cattle and whatever. It may not have been, huge or sophisticated, but the idea that this is mine and I own it is very deeply entrenched. And that's one of the big abuses of apartheid. So what's the solution? Well, stop going down the road we're on. I think that there are reasonable arguments to be made against the sort of instant conversion to title. The success of that has been mixed around the world, but certainly a process that takes us in that direction, that limits the discretion that outsiders have on the stuff that you have a claim on, and a land reform program that does redistribute, but it does it in such a way that this is that expands property rights rather than invest them in a venal and incompetent state.
Well, I think senior colleague Frans Cornet has made the point that all rights are basically anchored in property rights, and you can't have a democratic and prosperous society without strong property rights. And we've also, there's also been, we don't really have time to talk about it now, but research done by the Peruvian economist Fernando de Soto about if you give people title, how much capital gets unlocked, and then gives them opportunity to do other things and what have you. So yeah, it's obviously a tricky situation, but it's pretty clear we're on the wrong path at the moment. So, but moving on. So a number of organizations and individuals have come together to form a Defend Our Democracy movement, I think it's called. And there's an interesting list of names on it. There's some ANC luminaries, people like Frank Shikane and so on, and then some other people who used to be associated with the DA, Lindiwe Mazibuko and Musiba Mane. There's also Melanie Verwoerd, who was a former ANC MP and also ambassador to Ireland. A number of quite senior business figures. Michiel Leroux is one, Neil Froneman. So they've all come together to kind of make a point about what's happening in South Africa and threats to the constitution and so on. They've said any attempt to derail the constitution is counter-revolutionary, which is quite interesting. It's always find it quite funny when people in government talk about counter-revolutions as if they're in the revolution when you're in the government. But Sara, do you want to tell us a bit more about that, and what do you think about this new movement? It seems to be kind of the stepchild of the Stop Zuma marches from a couple of years ago.
Yeah, well, I think it's exactly that. I mean, the sort of names you mention are, I think Mo Sheikh was one of them who fingered Bulelani Ngcuka in that disaster. So these are all ANC stalwarts, and I think like the anti-Zuma movement, which was called Save South Africa, headed by Sipho Petiano, who's involved in this as well. The sort of retirees, I can't remember what the exact title of ANC people, headed a movement to get Zuma out, and which was understandable because he was doing terrible damage to South Africa and he was a complete embarrassment to the ANC. And I think this is really a sort of revved up version of the same thing. It's got a very impressive group of people, but it's saying defend our democracy, particularly our constitution. And this is in reference to the middle finger that Jacob Zuma has pointed to our constitution with regard to ignoring or completely disregarding constitutional court judgments that have affected him. Of course, it's a sort of kick of the dying horse as far as he's concerned. And then they also talk about the militias of the MK vets. Now, you're using the term militia very generously here. Yes, well, they're called militia. Well, I think our colleague Michael Morris is right, and this is really a kind of save the ANC from itself movement, because certainly shoring up the rule of law in the courts is an admirable thing to do, and this would obviously put some pressure on the ANC to pay a bit of attention, but it doesn't really aim at doing anything comprehensive. I mean, it's got scientists on it. It's got the South African Communist Party.
Gray, I'm not sure what she's. I mean, she's obviously done a lot about COVID and so on, but is she really a political voice?
No, she's a figure. She's a national. She's a celebrity. Shall I put it that way?
I'd listen to her about COVID. I'm not sure I'd listen to her about her political analysis.
Exactly. But I can understand the attraction. I think Cheryl Carolus is there. She was in the last movement. Adrian Basson sort of asks the same question, the editor of News 24, and he says, is this just a movement a la Save South Africa, which, is likely to fill it out, or is this the possible birth of a new party? And frankly, I think it's a kind of naive question because political parties are much more difficult, distinct entities to create. And you have got even within the sort of largely ANC camp, I mean, I do not see how you put Neil Froneman and Solly Mahile of the Communist Party in a party. So it's clearly it actually can't be there. Whether people want to, whatever you do, it's not a matter, and I'm going to argue this in much more detail at a later stage, but it's not a matter of whether you share an ideology in the emotional socialist versus free market sense. It's now become, it's a pragmatic issue. What policies do you tend to put in place, or would you put in place if you were in power, to the benefit or to the detriment of the people? And I think this is it's a great attention grabber. It was on Human Rights Day. It was a protest. It was peaceful. They had people they had orange overalls to make their point around, and things were in orange and very nicely done. But I don't think it's going to go anywhere. No one, I think, would disagree with it. But the question would be, well, and what happens now?
Well, perhaps this is we might see another split in the ANC, but as we all know, it is pretty cold outside the ANC. I think the EFF are the only party that's really done anything much after being formed by somebody who's left the ANC. I mean, COPE they've really collapsed since they came on the scene in 2009. UDM's still kind of there. And I mean, yeah, any attempts to start ANC or any kind of movements that have been birthed from the ANC, as I say, the only one who's done well is the EFF, and it looks like they might even have reached a ceiling in their support too. So I think there's only so much appetite for this radicalism in South Africa, but I could also be wrong with that. But Terence, what is your view on this? Do you think this is going to lead to anything? Or is just going to be, some fairly well-known South Africans trying to grab some headlines?
Well, it's interesting. I think that I remember KSAC being formed, which I think is going back into the 1990s, these civic petitions. There was the Home for All signature where white people could apologize for apartheid. The thing that intrigues me about
did you sign it, Terence?
Well, it's sort of. I want to get it. I'd read about it, and I went actually looking for a copy of the declaration, and I couldn't locate one, so I couldn't locate the original text, nor could I find where I could actually sign it. I think that these sort of movements are by their nature, and they're probably they have a cadenza for me saying this, but they're deeply elitist. This is about a small number of well-known people, hoping to lend their energies and their names, their reputations to particular sort of limited to a sort of a limited movement. What I remember from KSAC, less so with this Save Democracy, but it's certainly still there, is how aggressively it was trumpeted at the time. This is a movement from within the ANC, and essentially this is Mandela's ANC reasserting itself. I think that if South Africa is serious about trying to fix the problems, you might have to look at whether the tools and the institutions that you're trying to do it through are up to that task. I would say that there's maybe a massive emotional leap to saying that the ANC has now become the problem, and maybe it can't be reformed. Okay, well, what does that mean? Adrian Basson talks about a new party. As you say, you're going to have the Communist Party and Lombard Insurance in the same tent. I don't think so. I would also caution that if one looks at some of the signatories and some of the organizations, I see some of these people whose commitment to democracy is very much a sometimes thing. It's probably as motivated as much by the fact that they're not the ones in the driving seat. I wouldn't trust the SACP or COSATU with constitutional democracy further than I could throw their the entire combined mass of their head offices, which is probably not very far.
But as Sara said, or mentioned, our colleague Michael Morris said, this seems more of a Save the ANC movement. And a former colleague Gareth van Oorselen has also spoken about how people can't kind of perceive or imagine a South Africa where the ANC isn't this kind of hegemonic movement. And the opposition politics happens within the ANC, not so much outside it. But Tony Leon also makes the point in his book that once these kind of hegemonic parties start losing their way, they can collapse quite quickly. I mean, he makes an example of Labour in Israel, and then also the Gaullist parties in France after World War II and so on. But then also the counter-example of ZANU-PF, who has actually lost elections and has run Zimbabwe to the ground. I think we can all agree with that. And they still are holding on to power 20 years after they started losing their places as hegemonic force in Zimbabwe, and we can all see the consequences of that. So, but I mean, of course, Zimbabwe and South Africa are quite different countries. There's some strong similarities, but a lot of differences too, especially and within the ANC and ZANU-PF. I do think there's probably a stronger a tradition of internal democracy within the ANC than ZANU. I mean, it would have been unthinkable for a sitting president as Thabo Mbeki was to be challenged as he was in 2007 by Jacob Zuma, I mean, that would have never happened to Robert Mugabe, who controlled that party and the country with an iron fist. So yeah, it's I think it depends. We've got a couple of things. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of months. Terence?
Look, just to conclude my thinking on this, the ANC being the sort of natural leader and the party that without which many people cannot conceptualize the future. Something that I've observed since I was a teenager is ecclesiastical politics. Churches in South Africa are influential institutions, whether one is religious or not. And it's interesting to me just how much within many leading church figures and church institutions, the idea of the ANC has taken on almost religious intensity. In 2011, for instance, there was a document produced which invoked the Kairos document of the 1985 of the mid 1980s, the big church statement on the crisis in South Africa. And while it did criticize corruption or whatever, it left absolutely no doubt that we in the churches prostrate ourselves before the ANC as the natural leader of South Africa, and we just hope it can do better. Archbishop Tutu, I think in 2009, said he wasn't going to vote because of the way the ANC had treated
as if you can only vote for the ANC or abstain, as if there aren't 30 other parties, whatever, on the ballot.
Until people who are conscious and committed to the country are able to think beyond that.
But
I don't see movement.
But we've seen, a lot of people have kind of checked out. More people don't vote than vote in South African elections at the moment. So unless there's a movement that comes along that kind of grabs people's imaginations. And I hate to say it, but the FF seems to be the closest to something that gets people really excited. But who knows? Maybe Herman Mashaba's movement. I'm not too sure, but they could kind of be a possibility. So, what are your final thoughts on this?
I think this is a public relations breast beating. I see, for example, the Adrian Enthoven and Adrian Gore are signatories. I would much rather see them defend democracy by supporting their members or their clients or their customers and taking on the government on issues like the rollout of vaccines.
I think Neil Froneman's been quite good with that. I think he's probably been the bravest, most forthright South African corporates. Terence, there's a minute and a half left. What are your final thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, democracies I think can die very rapidly if they're not used. And I think that at some point many of the deep thinkers in this country need to decide whether their commitment and their emotional and intellectual energy is vested in a party that they have supported, or if they are willing to look at the greater good of the society. These two things I think are increasingly irreconcilable.
Yeah, so I think we're going to have an interesting couple of weeks, but it remains to be seen whether this Defend Democracy is going to be anything more than just a talk shop. Terence, I think you made a good point about organisations like KSAC. They come up every now and again. One of their prominent members might write an op-ed, or they'll have a press release or a letter to the editor. And also, a lot of this is just about saving the ANC. It's not really about saving South African democracy, really. So, yeah.
Can I just make a point, because you made a point about Israel and the Labour Party. What will make you succeed is whether you get acceptance that democracy and governance about the art of the possible, not the emotional.
Exactly. So yeah, but maybe this is South Africa kind of coming out the first phase of post-apartheid South Africa. Maybe this is it's not the end of the ANC, but it's probably the end of the beginning of the beginning of the end of the ANC.
End.
So yeah. So yeah, that's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening or watching. And Nicholas Lorimer is still moving tomorrow, so you'll have my dulcet Benoni tones rather than the more cultured St. Stadium's tones of Nicholas Lorimer tomorrow. So, but thanks for watching, and we'll catch you guys tomorrow. Thanks.